I'm Michael Prestwich, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Durham, which prefers to call itself Durham University these days. The history of medieval armies, it sounds a very glamorous subject. Gorgeous knights, splendidly dressed on great big horses, armour, lances, swords, charging the enemy, perhaps getting mown down by longbowmen, perhaps engaging in chivalrous single combat. There is that side to it, certainly, but a lot of the history of medieval warfare is actually very much more matter of fact. It's about logistics, it's about recruitment, it's about sieges, it's about armies campaigning, nothing very much happening. What I want to talk about today is one of the less glamorous aspects to do with recruitment, to look particularly at the problems around the notion of feudalism, military feudalism in particular. Feudalism is a very difficult word. It would be nice if we didn't use it at all. It has too many different meanings. You can use it in a very generalized Marxist sense, describing a whole economic system. Or you can follow what I suppose most American and British historians have done, and to take it more narrowly in a sense of what I call military feudalism. Now, the basic principle sounds easy enough, that the king would grant out land to great magnates in return for their military service. They would grant out land in turn to knights. They would perform that military service. The service would be for a period of 40 days at a time. And that all sounds very simple, very straightforward, and quite standardized actually through Western Europe. We know about it from Normandy, France, southern Italy, even the Crusader lands. The trouble is, it's not as simple as that. The sources for that theory, there's a splendid inquest that was held in 1166. The barons all sent in returns saying how many knights they'd got, and that gives a tremendous amount of information. But beyond that, if we go back earlier, the sources become much more difficult, and there are some quite tricky questions. The first question is, was all this something new that the Normans brought in with them with the conquest of the Battle of Hastings in 1066? And the old theory was that soon after that, perhaps in about 1070, the conqueror instituted the system of knight service. There's a writ probably from 1072 to the Abbot of Evesham asking him to provide the knights that he owed. It looks therefore as if the service was introduced then. There's the 13th century chronicle that much was made of, Roger Wendover, that indicates that in about 1070 knight service was introduced. But historians don't like nice, simple ideas. They want to complicate it. They want to challenge. That was a notion that was produced in the late 19th century, and historians want to challenge it, to look at different ways. And one attack was to think in terms of, well, wasn't there actually a good deal of continuity with what had happened in the Anglo-Saxon period previously? Didn't they have systems of military service that the Normans, in fact, used and modified? And certainly the Anglo-Saxons had a system whereby, we know this from Domesday Book, every 5 hides of land, a hide is variable in size. It used to be regarded as 120 acres, but it varied a lot. But that each 5 hides of land owed a soldier who would fight in the army, in the Fyrd, as it was called, for a period of 60 days. Now, if you could then show that Norman knights were granted units of 5 hides of land, and that they indeed were serving for 60 days, then that looked like continuity. And that was strongly argued by an American historian, Warren Hollister. There were difficulties. You certainly couldn't show that all Norman knights held units of 5 hides. A few did, but you certainly can't show that's generalized. And 60 days, we certainly know very solidly from 13th century evidence that feudal service was for a period of 40 days. There's no evidence whatsoever of any argument at any stage. whereby the barons all came and said, look, you've been charging us 60 days service, we now want to do 40 days. Nothing of that sort is recorded anywhere. The argument for 60 days is quite technical in a way. You could pay instead of doing feudal service. If you paid 30 shillings in lieu instead of doing your service, and if it was the case that a knight was paid sixpence a day, that 30 shillings would hire you a knight at sixpence a day for 60 days. That was what Hollister thought, and he felt that this was fine. That proved 60 days. The trouble is that that rate of 30 shillings was used on occasion, but other rates are also used. And one rate that was used was 26 and 8 pence. That sounds an odd sum of money, but it's in fact 2 marks or 4/3 of a pound. And if you had someone paying 26 and 8 pence, if a knight was paid not sixpence a day, but 8 pence a day, and there's some good evidence for 8 pence a day, that would work out at a 40-day period of service. The case perhaps isn't finally proven, but it seems pretty clear that we should be talking about a 40-day period of service, without any doubt. Now, we need to think hard about what the evidence really is. And one of the problems, and this was brought out by historian John Gillingham, is that if you look at the 11th century, at the post-conquest period, there is actually startlingly little evidence. He looked at the history of 15 Anglo-Norman churches to see if there's evidence there in the chronicles that were written about them of the introduction of night service. None of them mentioned anything of the sort. If you look at more obvious sources, if you look at Domesday Book, there's nothing about night service there at all. Admittedly, one of the best chroniclers of the period, Orderic Vitalis, does describe, he says that William the Conqueror wrote that William distributed land to his knights so that he got service of 60,000 knights. It's a rather vague statement. It can support certainly the idea of an introduction of feudal service, but it's a rare statement, and you have to set that against the silence of lots of other sources. One thing you can look at, of course, is grants, because there are some grants from this period that refer to service. They're surprisingly unspecific in some cases, that you get the Abbot of Westminster making a grant of for life to a knight in return for his service. That's not what happened later, when grants were in full hereditary right, that son would succeed father in this land. There's another from the Bishop of Hereford, that a knight should serve the bishop with 2 knights as his father did. That looks like hereditary tenure, but in fact the land concerned was not actually the land that his father had held. These grants show that the beginnings of the practice of granting land out in return for service, but certainly it's not the fully fledged hereditary system with a lot of other burdens of turning up at court, paying feudal aids or taxes at certain given points, like the paying a tax for the knighting of the Lord's eldest son, things of that sort. They start only appearing in the 12th century. Full hereditary right, yes, by the middle of the 12th century, probably. There's some historians who would date that even later. But it certainly doesn't look like a fully fledged system suddenly introduced in about 1070. Now, if we then look at how did service actually operate in practice, what evidence have we got for knights holding land in return for service, turning up and actually fighting on campaign? Historians actually haven't looked very hard at this, perhaps not surprisingly, because there is startling little evidence for it. There are no records of any feudal musters until the 13th century. There is no proper summons of the feudal host. We've got the summons to the Abbot of Evesham, yes, but otherwise we have to move again right on to the 13th century for proper requests to all the tenants-in-chief to produce the service that they owe. We know certainly about some armies that had got a component of knights serving in return for land. William Rufus, for example, complained in the course of his quarrels with his Archbishop Anselm complained about the quality of the knights that had been sent from Canterbury, clearly feudal service. We know that Henry II summoned a feudal host to serve in Ireland in the early 1170s. We know that at the end of his reign, 1186, that a feudal summons was issued for service in Galloway. Actually, the army never got into Galloway, but the summons was issued. The army clearly assembled. We've got a reference in the end of the 12th century, a guy called William Lovell in 1197, whose lands were forfeited because he hadn't gone to fight in Normandy as he'd been requested to. Though we don't know that that's necessarily a feudal summons, but it looks as if it possibly was. But the evidence really is astonishingly light if you look for chronicles saying this year a feudal summons was issued for the army to assemble. They just don't say that. What do they say about the way in which armies are organised? Accounts of campaigns actually give you very little idea about how the forces were recruited. It's pretty clear that the core of the army would consist of the king's royal household. In one case, certainly, in 1124, at the Battle of Bourg-Theroult, it was simply the king's knights, his household knights, who formed the entire army and won a victory in Normandy. In other cases, the chroniclers are simply quite unspecific. It's very clear that in many cases, mercenary forces were important. When Henry II faced his great rebellion in 1173-4, the key troops that he employed were mercenaries hired from Flanders, from Brabant, skilled crossbowmen, professional soldiers, and they were the crack troops of the day. They were the obvious people to turn to in such a case as that. And the argument is that really perhaps from the start, feudal service was not really important as far as recruiting armies was concerned. What it really was a way of squeezing money out of people, that you could get them to pay scutage, which is this alternative to serving. Either you served or you paid scutage. And what the king really wanted was to get scutage. He could then hire good and effective troops. The problem with feudal troops, they would only serve for 40 days. What happens at the end of 40 days? A campaign might last a great deal longer than that. They might not be the best kind of people. An extreme example would be the abbot of Bury, who was asked by William the Conqueror to provide for one of his knights, who unfortunately had been attacked by Danish pirates who'd cut his hands off. That knight could have been no use whatsoever in war. And there's a very famous chronicle statement, Robert of Torigny, who says that Henry didn't want to get rural knights, agrarios milites, to serve in his Toulouse campaign of 1159. He wanted the money instead with which you could hire proper troops. And he went with his magnates, a small number of people, hired the troops that he needed. And we know that from the 1166 returns. You can work it all out. That all sounds a nice, simple theory that feudal service really wasn't important. What was important about that system was that it provided the king with money to provide troops. Again, the theory sounds fine, but it's not quite as simple as that. If we look at the scutage records, and we've got very good financial records from Henry II's reign onwards in the so-called pipe rolls, then we can tell how much money ought to be coming in if you weren't getting any service done. We know that the number of knights' fees is around 5,000. We know that from the 1166 returns. So we would know how much money should come in if everybody simply paid scutage instead of doing service. In practice, it's clear that a lot of people did do service. It's clear that in 1161, for example, at least 3,500 knights performed service. Scutage was paid on the rest. And for Ireland in 1172, the number's rather less. It's about 2,000. It's probably less still for that 1159 campaign in France. At the end of the reign, it's about 2,300 turned up for that Galloway campaign. So service was therefore performed. You can't dismiss it as completely irrelevant. How it worked in practice is a very difficult question. We haven't got any records of feudal musters until the 13th century. By Edward I's reign, for example, we know exactly who turned up, how many troops they produced. We even know the names, in many cases, of the men that were performing the feudal service. But that's all to the future. We've nothing of that for the 12th century at all. And what happened at the end of 40 days? It's pretty clear that, again, in a much later period, in Edward I's reign, that at the end of 40 days, most people would simply take the king's pay and continue fighting, or continue on campaign. There was no question of everybody goes home at the end of 40 days. But we simply don't know what was happening in the 11th century, in the 12th century. We don't know whether there were clerks carefully noting down that so-and-so had produced exactly the right number of troops, that he was down to produce 93, and you actually count the 93 men. Or, and I suspect this is what happened, that if someone turned up with a decent, reasonable-sized contingent, the king would be perfectly happy with that. Now, another question is, how far was this a standardized system? As far as the Crown was concerned, certainly it looks standard enough, that the great landlords are all allocated a given number of knights to produce. The levels of the quotas are rather less in the north of England than they were in the Midlands and the south, but the system looks the same everywhere. Where it starts not to look so standardized is if you look at how magnates themselves start allocating the service among their tenants. In many cases, of course, they did simply grant land out to knights in return for that service or for the dues that were due from that land. But in other cases, we find something really rather different happening, that you might divide the land up into really quite small units. And if you find that somebody holds a 20th of a knight's fee, well, you can't really believe that, can you? You can't believe that someone actually turns up and serves, say, for 2 days and says, that's the 20th of service done, I've done my bit. Or Richard Bassett lands in Northamptonshire, and each ploughland on his estates was assessed at as a 15th part of a knight's fee. So clearly there, all Bassett was doing was getting his tenants to pay a rent which covered the service, and he would presumably then go out and hire some knights. He'd have some household knights of his own. That's how he would do the service. If he chose to serve in person, he might well choose simply to pay scutage. So a system which looks on the surface to be, from the top level, to be standardized, at a lower level, it really wasn't. Another question, I think, which is not much asked, but is worth looking at, is what were the political implications of all of this? Because this is actually quite a substantial burden on landlords and on their tenants, either providing the actual service or providing the scutage. And didn't they mind? Didn't they object? It is extraordinary, to go back to Gillingham's point about those 15 accounts of Anglo-Norman churches, that there are no complaints about the imposition of night service. When the Pope was complaining and he corresponded to the Archbishop of Lanfranc, that there are no issues and complaints there coming up about the imposition of night service. It doesn't appear to be a political issue at all. It's possible that if we move on into the 12th century, that the great returns of 1166 into night service, that they may reflect argument that the king was having with the barons. Because what that inquest was about was asking people, what did you owe in the old days, in Henry I's reign? And how many new knights have there been introduced into your land since 1135, since Henry I's death? It looks as if possibly it might be that there were arguments going on of the king saying, look, these old figures back from 1135, we know that's not what's really happening. You've actually got many more knights, and I want to have the service of all that you've got rather than what was in the past. But we don't know that. It may be that it's a much more simple matter of an inquiry, really for financial purposes, because the king was due to pay and collect an aid for the marriage of his eldest daughter, and that's all that it's about. It isn't clear. It's an odd survey, the 1166 one, because it wasn't conducted by royal officials going out and getting the information, as was done, say, with the Domesday Book. It was simply a matter of getting the magnates to write in and say what they thought their obligations were. So it looks as if it may have been pressure from the barons who said, look, we really want to get this sorted. This is actually what we owe. Conceivably political problems at that point, but that's purely in the range of hypothesis. When we do start getting problems about service is by the end of the 12th century, because by that time things have changed a lot. Knights are much richer. They are far fewer. Their equipment is more elaborate, is more expensive. And one of the effects of this, that knights back in the conquest period were in a sense two a penny. There are a lot of knights, ordinary cavalrymen, all classed as knights. By the late 12th century, the knight is appearing as really a significant landholder, a man of rank, a man of status. And the numbers were clearly far fewer. And that meant that if you owed a very large number of knights and real service was actually expected, that was going to be quite problematic. If you're Geoffrey Fitzpeter, who owed 98 1/3 knights, you're not going to be very keen on shipping in 1210 98 1/3 knights off to Ireland. So actually what you take is 10 knights. And the king is clearly quite happy that you've done your service, you provided a decent contingent of 10 knights, even though actually you owed about 10 times as many as that. It's interesting that in the previous reign, Richard I had wanted service of 300 knights to serve for a year, rather than a full feudal service, as it were, for a 40-day period. There's lots of other examples. The Earl of Devon, who owed 89 knights, providing service actually of 20 in 1214. So there clearly is a mismatch has happened between the formal numbers that are owed and the actual numbers of knights that people could really seriously be expected to provide. And so we find that in the so-called Unknown Charter, which, well, there's some argument about its date, but it's probably 1213, demands being made of the king that would lead eventually to Magna Carta, that one of the clauses in that says that anyone that owes 10 knights should have their service assessed by my barons. Possibly this means by the barons of the Exchequer. But in other words, that anyone that owes more than 10 will look at it seriously and presumably they would expect to serve with a decent-sized contingent, but not these huge numbers of up to 100. And clearly that was something that the magnates were feeling strongly about, and they wanted to get this sorted. And you would expect, therefore, that this would be a big issue come Magna Carta. And you look at Magna Carta with some amazement that military service really barely features in it. That there's simply an anodyne clause that says no one should be asked to provide more service for a knight's fee than is owed from it. That's all it has to say on that score. And that's really quite startling. And, I mean, it could be that it's because actually there wasn't much argument, because nobody was really bothered and the king was quite happy with a decent-sized contingent, wasn't demanding the full numbers. Or it could be, and I think this is more likely, that the crown was simply not willing to give way on an issue of military service, that it was not willing to give up rights. John was not willing to give up rights he'd got to military service. Kings were very reluctant to do this. The first king, in fact, who did give up rights that he claimed would be Edward III, who's a king who had no difficulty in recruiting troops whatsoever. So I think that's probably what it's about. And what actually happened, that over in the years after Magna Carta, by probably a process of individual bargaining, the quotas of service that were expected were reduced radically. Not by a standard proportion, not by reduced to a tenth across the board, but on an ad hoc piecemeal basis, and they were cut down to really a very, very small level, so that feudal service would consist of, I suppose if you asked for a full feudal service, you'd be getting knights in the hundreds rather than the thousands. You'd be getting perhaps 500 or something of that sort. You would still, however, have the financial burden that scutage would still be levied on the full theoretical old fees, the 5,000 fees that's been assessed and set out in the 12th century period. I think it's worth saying something about other forms of feudal service, because it's not just a matter of 40 days service in the Royal Army. Curiously, there's actually more evidence probably about what's called castle guard, the obligation on knights to provide castle garrisons, than there is for these field armies. And we know of very elaborate rota systems, for example, that were set up for knights at Dover is one good example. Richmond in Yorkshire is another. At Dover, it was worked roughly on a month or a 30-day principle, with rotas of knights serving. At Richmond, it was organised in such a way that the garrison was twice as large in summer as in winter, because summer, of course, is the campaigning season. And it looks as if this is a realistic system intended to provide actual garrisons. And even as late as the 15th century, there's a drawing of Richmond Castle showing the towers of the castle with the banners of the various constabularies flying from each tower, showing which section of the castle each constabulary of knights was responsible for in providing this service. It's a little odd to think that people really turned out and spent substantial amounts of time sitting around, rather bored and probably quite drunk, in a castle for a month, maybe in some cases more. That at Norwich, the Abbot of Bury was supposed to provide 4 groups of 10 knights, each serving for 3 months to serve castle guard. And a very odd feature about this, too, is that actually not every castle had systems of castle guard. The greatest castle of all, the Tower of London, did not. Colchester, another great, massive stone castle of the Conquest period, no castle guard recorded there. It is very odd. It is perfectly plain that this is a form of service that was clearly turned into a monetary payment, a rent, from an early date. It's hard to imagine that somebody would would go from Oxfordshire, go all the way to Dover to perform his military service and then go back again. Of course he would prefer to pay a money rent. You didn't actually need to have a large garrison in a castle all the time anyway. You wouldn't want these people hanging around, as I say, getting drunk and carousing. You wanted a small professional group of men who would maintain the structure, look after it properly. At time of need, you would want to hire knights as a garrison. But there was this system of castle guard in existence. It was remembered. It did go on right through. And I ought just to say, too, that though I was talking largely in terms of feudal service up to the period of Magna Carta, that the other form of, the main form of feudal service, of the armies, that did continue, albeit in a very reduced form, with the final effective summons being issued in 1327. So it did go on. People did go on producing service as late as that. It is something that is realistic. You can't go with the argument that the whole thing was simply financial from the outset. That doesn't work any more than it doesn't work to say this is how armies were actually formed and this is the real basis of medieval armies. It's an element, but no more than an element. One thing I'm conscious of in talking about this is that there's really no human interest, is there, in what I've been saying? I'm afraid that many sorts of medieval history are matters of looking at charters, at account books, adding up the sums, and the human side doesn't really come out that strongly. You do find some nice things occasionally in this that make you sit up slightly. There's the nice case of the tenant of the Earl of Gloucester, called Elias Testiculis Aureis. Elias Golden Balls, but I think you'd be a bit stuck to trace David Beckham's descent from that particular tenant of the Earl of Gloucester. Nice if someone could do it. Where you really find the nice bits are actually in the oddities of a slightly different form of feudal service, that below knight service you could have sergeanty service. That's not knights, but it's the next rank down, as it were. And the really nice examples, I'm afraid, are not military, but there are some military ones. There's the chap who owed service, was obliged to turn up mounted with a bow and arrow. And he was obliged to use this, but he only went with one arrow. So the first time he saw any enemy, he shot off his arrow, and then that was his service done, and he could go off back home again. There are these occasional characters of that sort, but it's more the service of the chap who holds a manor in return for packing up the king's chess set when he's finished playing, and rearing royal puppies, looking after the royal hawks. The famous one, of course, is the tenant of the manor of Hemingston in Suffolk. The tenant was to appear at the king's court every Christmas Day and leap, whistle and fart for the king's amusement. But I'm sorry, that's not, unfortunately, a military tenure. Finally, how important is all this? First question, I suppose, did feudal military service provide the Normans with some kind of advantage over the Anglo-Saxons? Is this one of the keys to Norman success in the 11th century? I think actually that's quite hard to argue. The key is the military technology that the Normans had, the knight on his horse with a good coat of mail, experienced in the use of his lance, his sword with a splendid helmet and a nasal on. I mean, the Norman knight is clearly a pretty invincible weapon in the 11th century, but tie that into how he actually holds his land and his obligation in the 40 days, that doesn't really work. These knights could be hired. They're just as effective in warfare, however you recruit them. So it's the military technology there. And, of course, also very important is the military technology of the castle. That's vital in establishing Norman control, but that's, again, got nothing to do with systems of military service. How important is this feudal system in providing kings with armies? Well, it provides a significant element. It provides really quite useful numbers on occasion. I suppose at a vital point, I've referred already to that rebellion of 1173-4, when you couldn't really rely on the nobles, on your tenants, and so you turned to mercenary troops, and they were the key crack troops of the 12th century. The feudal element is one part of a complex military system, and it's no more than that. And it is. I wouldn't stress its importance in those terms. In financial terms, then I think it is quite significant. Scutage is important at a time when there are few other forms of taxation, when the old Anglo-Saxon geld is yielding less and less money. It's a very antiquated system with all sorts of increasing problems, exemptions and so forth. And scutage is useful. The problem with it is, of course, that you could only levy it when you'd actually got a campaign. John started changing that and started levying it virtually every year, whether there's a campaign or not. And that is something, of course, that was raised in Magna Carta and was strongly objected to. and taxation becomes fully subject to proper consent and eventually parliamentary consent. And finally, I think this military feudalism is, of course, part of a landholding structure, a complicated landholding structure involving hereditary right, involving a whole legal system. That's a whole different ballgame, as it were. And the introduction of feudal land law is something very, very important. But that's a different topic. It's not really... feudal military service is a part of that, but it's a very small part of that quite different story.